All right, so good evening, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us tonight for I keep counting, but I think it's sixth webinar of the series. And we're so fortunate that we have Professor Kelly O'Neill with us again tonight. And Professor Kelly O'Neill is one of the Davis Center's faculty and staff members, and she heads the Imperia program, and she's one of my favorite colleagues. And as I always say, she's so marvelous. Every time I sit and talk to her, I learn something new. So I hope that you will learn something. So not only do I hope, I know that you will learn something very, very interesting today and very different about Eurasian rivers. And Kelly always works with data and maps, and so I'm looking forward to see how we can convert this into learning about history of the region. So, without further ado, Kelly, the stage is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. The night after St. Patrick's Day, I'm sure everyone is just emotionally exhausted. So I really appreciate the energy on a Wednesday evening. Um, so I proposed back when Sandra and colleagues were putting together this workshop series, and we're talking about, what would be a good thing to, what were good topics, right? The kinds of topics that you need to kind of dig into and understand in order to really make sense of Eurasian environments, right? And I immediately, it was kind of out of my mouth right away. Well, we have to talk about rivers, right? You just have to talk about rivers. And Sandra said, sure, okay, great. Just that sounds fine. I'll, put it on the calendar. And ever since then, I've been thinking, okay, yeah, I don't second guess my decision that we needed to talk about rivers, but it's been really interesting to me to kind of tease out for myself what I really meant by that statement and why I felt so strongly that we needed to talk about rivers. Um, and I started asking myself a whole bunch of questions, some of which are questions I've asked before and seemed painfully obvious and yet kept coming into my head. Questions like, do rivers have histories? Right? What does it mean to think about rivers historically? What can rivers teach us about history as opposed to geology and biology and all kinds of other things? Um, can we use rivers as primary sources? And if so, in what way and using what methods? Um, and then I started asking myself kind of another set of questions, trying to think about, historically, if you're thinking from with a historian's hat on about what rivers are and what function they have, you start asking yourself all kinds of things, right? But including things like, how do states think about rivers, right? And then not just states, but individuals think about rivers at various moments in time, right? You could be really cheeky and say, how do rivers think about rivers? But we're not going to go there, right? I'm not going to get, that crazy about these things. But I really think this question of whether or not rivers have history or whether it makes sense to think about rivers historically, um, is a good one because it kind of prompted me on a particularly traffic-ridden drive home one day a couple of weeks ago to really think about, kind of turn it to the question of, how do we determine whether anything has a history, right? How do we choose our subjects, right? What is the real distinction between a person who has a history and a person who has barely any history? I suppose most people, their existence gets documented by some sort of birth record, but not everywhere all the time. So you don't get the same level of historical kind of narration possibility for every human being. And it's certainly true that you don't get the same historical, narrative possibility with every river that you encounter. And so I came up with a really imperfect, highly argumentative shorthand for figuring out whether the thing that you're talking about or wanting to talk about should have a history or has a history. So I'm going to try it out on you. It's only 3 words long, and we can, talk about whether or not this is at all useful. But I kind of narrowed it down into my head to this concept that the thing you're talking about has to have documented observable change. in some way. The change part is really important, right? Historians, if we're in the classroom, if we're in the archive, we're looking for change over time, right? That's what we do. That's kind of the bread and butter of history. As Sandra mentioned, and probably many of you have caught on to the fact, yeah, I do a lot with maps and spatial thinking and spatial history. And when we're thinking about maps, and kind of spatial thinking, you need change across space, right? So if everything is constant and nothing's changing, you don't need a map because the space isn't changing. It's kind of an unchanged homogeneous surface. It's hard to imagine that ever really being the case, but the closest you can come to it is if you imagine that you're looking at a map of North America and Europe or Africa, and there's a huge expanse of ocean. And if you're looking at a big Mercator map, it just appears blue, as if there's no change across the surface of the ocean. We all know that's crazy, right? But that's the concept, right? You don't really need that map because it's just blank space, right? There's no change that's getting documented. So change is essential. Um, that change needs to be observable, right? So lots of things, whether they're animate or inanimate, change over time, but not all of those changes are observed. And if something is observable, that's important. You have to be able to see it and measure it in some way. And kind of baked into that word is also the idea that, there's some sort of relationship between the person who's doing the observing and the thing that's being observed. Like there has to be some relevance, right? There's some relationship there. So you need not just change, but observable change. And then the last bit is probably the most obvious bit, right? It has to be documented, observable change, right? So if you observe lots and lots of amazing changes, but you keep all of those thoughts in your head and never write them down, from a purist perspective, that really never enters the historical record. It never becomes part of history. So it's not something that you can actually write about. So you can imagine sitting on the bank of a river that is flowing and there are fish going by and the fishermen come and go and a boat goes by and all kinds of things change and you're able to observe them, and you never sit down and document it in any way, right? In theory, that you are not writing a history of the river. You might be composing a history of the river that will get expressed orally or through some other kind of tradition. And this is why we can argue about this highly imperfect definition later, right? But I'm just kind of putting it out there. So these kinds of thoughts were rattling around in my head as I was thinking about kind of what historians should say about rivers, why rivers matter in history, how you go about writing the history of a river. What does that look like, right? It doesn't really have a date of birth at like an end point and a beginning point. So you have to then think what story within a very kind of geomorphological time that you want to be telling. And I'm not the first person to think about these things. And lots of people have written about rivers. In fact, so many people have written about rivers and bodies of water that, um, you know, you can group historians into different categories. Are you the kind of historian who is really interested in writing about rivers and environments because you're interested in what is called the urge to explore, the urge to document and to measure, right? There's a whole genre of that. There's another whole bucket of historians who think about attempts to manage and transform environments and rivers in particular over time. Historians think about utilization and management and even how rivers and other forms of nature have been conceptualized, right? So there's lots of stuff out there. There are lots of vocabularies, like methods for thinking about rivers. But I'm not really big into composing historiographies, right? It's not, I sometimes I like to kind of be a little bit, um, just kind of sidestep the existing thinking and just try to come back to things on my own terms. And so I sat back and I was thinking about, well, what kind of things do rivers do, right? What are their activities? Because if you think about the activities that you associate with a river, that might then help us think about what kinds of documents might have been produced that would enable us to think about the history of a river. So rivers do really, I'm sure do lots of other things, but among them, they rise, they flow, they flood, they freeze, they melt, right? They thaw this time of year. They're beginning to thaw. They eddy, they evaporate, they carry things, right? They erode, they rot, and they fall. They do lots of other things. I'm sure all of you could add lots of activities to that list. And rivers are composed. It's also, I think, important anyway, to think about what constitutes a river, right? A river isn't just water. Water is a core element, but the river is also defined by the riverbed, by the banks, by the things that are within the river, the soil type. Rivers are susceptible to all kinds of forces, whether they're human or non-human forces, climate, season, um, weather events, industrial activities. So if you really stop and think about it, it is pretty easy to convince yourself that there is a sufficient evidence that rivers and humans interact, right? And they interact to such an extent that they do, in fact, produce a documentary record that enables us to write histories that have to do with rivers, river histories, histories of rivers, all of that. And, this is probably, I think, probably rewarming ideas that have probably been in your head many times in the past, just kind of like a warm-up exercise. I'm sure you're all aware of ways in which, or examples of the interaction between a river and some episode of human history, right? There are really famous examples from the American West where you have the rise of the fur trade in the American West, where you get the elimination of such large numbers of beavers that the courses of rivers change, right? Because the beavers aren't damming the rivers in the same way. And you get increased sediment transport down courses of river that change all kinds of things. There are timber harvesting, right, is a phenomenon that goes on almost all continents, right? And that also has altered the courses of rivers around the globe, in the Alps, the Andes, the Urals, the Rockies. Road development, railway development. There are lots of these kind of things that humans do that have an enormous impact on rivers, and activities that are in turn impacted by rivers. We think of the 19th century, probably if we're to paint in really grandiose strokes, the 19th century is the century of canal euphoria, right? Everyone wanted to build canals because they had this idea that the way to improve nature was to make it more straight, to make it predictable, to shorten the distance between places by taking out meanders and eddies and things like that. So the 19th century is the era of canal building, dredging, straightening. Like there's a lot of this on lots of different continents. Since if you just think of the case of the United States, and I promise I'll get to Eurasia in just a second, but within the United States, the Army Corps of Engineers has worked on some 26,000 miles of waterways, making them navigable to vessels since the Civil War. 26,000 miles of waterway, right? So it's a huge amount of intervention in the hydrological landscape. And if we move into the 20th century, you go from canal euphoria to dam building euphoria, right? And there are these big signature projects of the Soviet state, in China, the United States, of course, North America in general, of dam building and hydropower. You might also say, well, don't forget irrigation, right? Irrigation is a big thing too. Of course, that's another big thing, right? That's connected to all of this. So there are these big tropes, right? There are big trends. There's a lot of occurrence of rivers in history, whether or not they're treated as the thing that is being like the object of analysis or part of the context. So with all of that kind of rumbling around in my head, I was thinking about, so I'm a historian of the Russian Empire. So I was thinking about, if I want to find documents about rivers, where's the first place to go? And you probably all have a favorite place, like a starting point for a research project, right? Well, I'm going to turn to my trusty whatever, and it will give me a little bit of a foothold in this topic. And for historians of the Russian Empire, basically, history, Russia all the way up until World War I in particular, the starting point, at least as I was trained, is something called the full complete collection of Russian laws. And it's the shorthand is the PSZ, the complete collection of Russian laws. All of the decrees of the czars and kind of all the little guidelines and guidances and tariff bills and all kinds of things were collected on three occasions in the 19th century and published in chronological order. And so you get these huge multi-volume sets. And it sounds like the driest, most boring thing you could possibly imagine, right? And in a certain way, it is. But um, if you are willing to kind of give it a try, it provides an incredible set of answers to almost any question you can imagine. So I took the question, hey, what about rivers? What can we know about rivers? What does the complete collection of the law code of the Russian imperial state, what does it have to say about rivers? Right. So I went to the complete collection. I did a little topic search and turned up a whole section of legislation pertaining to rivers, basically starting from the 1830s and moving through the late imperial period. Um, and it turns out like the topics in general, just to save you, I know you're probably dying to go through the Russian law code yourself. I'm just gonna ruin it for you. Spoiler alert. Basically, the topics that are covered there are decrees that are talking about making rivers navigable. And if they can't be made navigable, which means that you can actually get a ship with a hull that pulls about 9 feet down the river, if you can't get a ship like that down the river, can you at least float things down it? Like, can you take a whole bunch of timber and bind it all together and float it down a river? So there's a lot of interest in that. There are decrees about the management of bridges and riverbanks, um, the privileges and obligations that are assigned to moving things around rivers. You probably have seen at some point in your life, there's a really famous painting by Ilya Repin of the barge haulers, right? Where you have these sad looking, but very strong peasants who are hauling a barge up a river. So, until you had steam come in the 1830s and 40s, that was basically how you're moving vessels upstream. There are commissions to study rivers, right? The Russian Empire loved a good commission, loved a good committee, loved a good report. So there are lots of reports that are written. There's lots of legislation about the confiscation of property from people who owned property along riverbanks. And they needed to, if they wanted to facilitate dam construction and things like that, it was a question of what are we going to do with private property and confiscation of property. And one of my favorite things that you find in the Russian law code, there's a whole section on warning signs. The necessary warning signs that you have to post on rivers. Like the caution, don't fall in here, you'll die because there's an eddy, or, steer your ship through, 6 feet to the left, all of these things. There's a whole section on warning signs, which makes for some really great reading. So I went through all of that and I thought, okay, I could subject you to a whole bunch of Russian, like excerpts from the Russian law code. And I thought, that's terrible. I'm not going to do that to you. So I figured I needed to find another source. So one last source, and I'll show you what this one looks like. I'm not going to show you the Russian law code. Um, I actually, we're going to skip over. I have a couple maps, but I'm going to skip over this really basic one. This is just, okay, warm up. We'll do it just to kind of get you going. This is basically the western part of the Russian Empire, right, in the 19th century. If it's orange, it's part of the Russian Empire. And the gray lines that you see are provincial boundaries. You see the Black Sea in the south, and you see the Baltic Sea up in the northwest. So this is the kind of general context. I know this is about Eurasian rivers. I decided to not talk about all of the rivers of Eurasia because we would be here until next year. So I decided to choose a small subset. So that's the general territory of the Russian Empire. These are all the rivers that you find in that territory. So this is taken from one of the big atlases of the Russian Empire. So lots and lots of rivers, right? Obvious takeaway of this map is that there are lots of rivers. They're not evenly distributed, but lots of rivers. And you might say, oh, this is old data. Sure, maybe it looks much different because normally if you go to a general map, of Ukraine or Russia, it will have the political boundaries, and you're probably only going to see a few rivers, right? You'll see the Dnieper River. If you're looking at Russia, you'll see the Volga, the Don, but you're not going to see something like this. Unless, of course, you go looking for an actual river map, right? So this is EU data showing all of the rivers of Russia, Belarusia, like this whole region. Like rivers are everywhere, right? The earth is lousy with rivers. They're everywhere. It is so when you're thinking about what kind of history you're going to write, how you're going to think about these networks of water, right? Oh, hang on. My blinds are going down. One second. Okay, so I decided we'll focus in on one little area. We're going to look at one river, and it's called the Dniester River, and it's in modern day Ukraine for the most part. Um, and you can see it on this map. If you can see the difference between the colors, you have green rivers in the background. That's the EU data. And then there's an area that's in blue, kind of shaded in blue. That's the like watershed of the Dniester River. And the dark line that you see running along, that's the course of the river itself. So I wanted just to highlight that it's not just about where the water is, but the territory that's adjacent to it and that drains into it is important to consider too. So that's the area we're going to look at. So what I thought to myself is, okay, I love the 18th century and the early 19th century. So let's start there, right? What did people know about that river in the 1790s? And then let's make it even more fun. Let's see, what did people who didn't live in the Russian Empire, but who spoke English and lived in Great Britain, what did they know about the Dniester River in the 1790s? If you want to answer that kind of question for yourself, you pull out your handy dandy gazetteer slash geographical dictionary. It's possible that not everyone has a geographical dictionary published in 1798 on their bookshelf, but you should because it's like the best thing ever. If you were kind of kid who grew up on Encyclopedia Britannica and you like that kind of thing, like me, you will have fun with geographical dictionaries. So okay, we're going to start with one that was published by an Englishman, even though it's still almost St. Patrick's Day and I'm Irish, and so I'm a little bit not okay with this, but we're going to go with an Englishman. So we are going to go with the definition of the Dniester River that you would find in a gazetteer geographical dictionary published by a man named John Walker. It's a John Walker. It's a very solid English name. He's okay though, because he in his childhood worked in a forge. And then when he was in his teenage years, he moved to Dublin, right? That's a good move. And that's where he learned, he got into drawing and engraving and then taught classics and math. And while he was a high school teacher of classics and math, in his free time, he compiled an 800-page geographical dictionary. Right. So this is what he did in his spare time. What do you do in your spare time? I hope you don't make geographical dictionaries, right? But this is what this guy did. And here's what he wrote. Dniester River, 1798, a fine river of Europe, which rises in Red Russia or Galicia, and falls into the Black Sea between the mouths of the Danube and the Dnieper. Cool. Reasonably accurate, like not terribly in depth, but okay, this is something we can work with. And then I thought, okay, what about if we wanted to know not what this guy living in, the British Isles and Ireland thought, but let's take it to the United States. Like, what did a nice American geographical dictionary have to say about the Dniester River? Right? Because our students would care more about what an American geographical dictionary would say. So I pulled out my favorite American geographical dictionary, which was, of course, authored by Jedediah Morse. Jedediah Morse. What a great name. And do you know who he is? Does anyone know who Jedediah Morse is? You want him to be the father of Samuel Morse, right? And he is the father of Samuel Morse, right? And he is also from, the Northeast. And he published in his spare time a geographical dictionary. And this one's published in 1821. This is the third edition of his geographical dictionary, but I think it was only a few years. I think it started in 1818 or something. So there's about a 20-year gap between these two descriptions of the river. And this is what Jedediah Morse said. That the Dniester is a river of Europe which rises in the Carpathian Mountains in Austria and Galicia And after passing by very difficult places to pronounce, um, it runs into the Black Sea by Ovidiopol and Ackerman. Its navigation has been recently improved by the Russian government, and the Poles now send a considerable portion of the produce of their soil through its medium to the flourishing port of Odessa, situated on the Black Sea near its mouth. Hmm. You've probably noticed, if you haven't zoned out entirely, that there's a big difference between these little descriptions of the Dniester. There seems to be change over time here, right? Something is different. Um, Something seems to have happened to the Dniester, which in the 1790s was just a fine river of Europe. And now you've got Polish merchants everywhere, right? And there are ports along it. And the Russian government is involved. Like lots of things have happened. And so the obvious question we ask ourselves is, what happened and why? And of course, you can ask yourself, do you care? You totally care. I promise this is going to be a good story because then you have to ask yourself, okay, if we're interested in understanding about the Dniester River, what sources, like where in history, historical documents, do we want to go to find the answer to the why question? Okay, we're not going to go to the law code. It doesn't know. The geographical dictionaries, they're only telling us this little story. So we go to the archives, right? So I want to tell you my second favorite story from the archives of all time. My first favorite, well, no, I have three. Where is this one? This might be number three. Ooh, let me think about that. Okay. There was one time when I found Catherine the Great's coffee order. That's like number one. That was like my total favorite. But this is either number two or three. It's really great. So here's the story. And we're going to listen to this story. And I want you to entertain the notion that if you listen to this story, you will learn something important about rivers and empires and environments, right? And we might not know exactly the whole story right away, but we can tease it out. So the story goes like this. You need to imagine yourself in 1803. 1803. Um, I might use a little visual prop here. Yeah, let's just because it's easier to imagine when you have faces to go with the story. Um, it's 1803, and the whole story starts with a letter. And the letter is not written by either of these guys, but they read it. And the guy on the left is Count Kochubey. The guy on the right is Count Rumentsov. And both of them are basically, they're two of the highest ranking members of the court of Alexander the First and Nicholas the First. They occupy, like every high ranking Russian has like five different ranks, and they're all Minister of Interior and Minister of this, Minister of that. So they're both Minister of Interior at different times. But the guy on the right, Rumentsov, who is famous for his role in the Napoleonic Wars, he was also the very first Minister of Water Transport, right? Which is very exciting. So the guy on the right with the amazing green robe, gets a letter from the guy on the left, who is Count Kochubey, who at the time was the Minister of Interior, who in turn got a letter from a very low-ranking guy who worked at the port of Odessa. And he had a very strange conversation with a crazy Polish landowner who turned out to not just be a landowner, but a whitewater rafter. So what happened was in 1803, there was this guy who lived in the Polish provinces. Let me go back to, do I have a little map here? Yeah, so if let's go back to our map. Okay, here's a little map. So this guy lived near Ushitsa. So if you look, there are a bunch of red dots, and if you look in the middle of the scattering of red dots on the kind of north side of the river, you'll see a place called Ushitsa. And this Polish landowner lived right in that area. He owned property, and he had been hearing for about 10 years. I think he grew up as a kid, sitting around the fire or wherever they had the hearth or wherever, and he heard stories of another Polish landowner who was about 15 years older than him, who had done this insane whitewater rafting trip down the Dniester River. And he had put together, he used flat bottom boats, barks and galleys, and just decided to basically run the rapids. The rapids on the Dniester are in the middle section of the river. So he basically, it was just him and I'm guessing a few of his friends got on these ships and just sailed as fast as they could down the Dniester. And it took them 5 or 6 days to make it all the way down. And it's one of those episodes that I don't have any documents describing it. I just imagine, but everyone seems to know about it, right? I think it's just one of those stories that everyone just passed around. And our man, Mierzejewski, the 1803 guy, heard these stories and was inspired. And he was inspired also, he was growing all this produce on his property. He had lots of grain, he had lots of timber, he had lots of oak trees, and he wanted to sell them all and make a lot of money. So what he wanted to do was prove that you could not only sail in a little raft down the river, but that you could actually make it from the middle course of the river down to the port of Odessa, because in 1803, the port of Odessa is starting to really, really rise, like out of nowhere, right in the wilderness. And everyone's getting excited about making money in the Black Sea. There are French merchants and English merchants floating around, and everyone's getting rich, and everyone wants in. So all of these landowners in the interior provinces are like, okay, we need to do this thing. So Mierzejewski, he's our name, he's our guy. His name is Ludwig Mierzejewski. It's a great name, right? So he gets on, he loads his galley. He actually goes in a masted vessel and he kind of loads it up a bit and he starts making his way down the rapids and he makes it. He gets all the way down to Ovidiopol, which you can see down near the mouth of the river. It took him 8 or 9 days. I think he was a little disappointed in himself. I think he wanted to set a record, but he didn't. He blamed the wind. He said that there were countervailing winds, and he said also that he was bringing so much grain down with him that it slowed his progress. So he went about 700 miles. It's a very long journey. It wasn't all rapids, but there were definitely rapids. And once you get past Tiraspol, so if you look you're kind of winding down the river, you pass Dubosare and you get to Tiraspol, it gets really flat. Like the river gets really flat and very shallow, very, 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 very shallow. So it's actually really difficult to move quickly. But he makes it. He gets down there and he gets to Ovidiopol and he takes all of his goods and he loads them into a wagon and he travels by road to Odessa, which you can also see on the map. It's very close by. And he reports his adventure to an engineer his name is De Volant, if you want a little Frenchman in the story. We've got a Frenchman in the story. And he is a rising star in the Department of Water Communication, which is that department that fancy guy with the green robe is in charge of. So it's through that guy, he starts like, oh, wow, this guy made it all the way down the river. This is gonna change everything. So De Volant starts passing the news up the chain, right? And meanwhile, Mierzejewski, he was very pleased with himself. He fills a couple of ships with goods he goes home, he fills a couple ships with more goods, he sails back. He takes 50 shipworthy timbers, like oak timbers, he sails them down and he sets out, goes down the Dniester, brings all this stuff down so that he can prove that the Black Sea fleet, the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, could be provisioned with timber from the Dniester River more efficiently and more cheaply than by anyone who's living along the Dnieper or the Bug. So it's this big competition thing. So he has commercial interests as well. And he basically, he starts telling everyone who was willing to listen that if people will start sailing the Dniester, right, people can import salt from Crimea. We take certain things for granted in the modern world, but getting your hands on a really stable supply of salt was really important for preserving food and all kinds of things. And Crimea was one of the big producers of salt, right? And so if you can get to Crimea easily down the Dniester, Crimean salt could be shipped up. You could bring it up follow the course of the river toward the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There are lots of markets up there, and you can sell it, right? All over. You can sell it to the Prussians, you can sell it to the Austrians, you can make a killing. Right, so everyone's getting really exciting. And we never hear from Mierzejewski again. Like he disappears from the archival record. I have no idea what happened to him. I'm sure there are records of him in the local archives, but I haven't had a chance to track him down. That's all we know about what he did. His whitewater rafting excursion, which was, intentional, but also lucky. What's important, there are lots of things that are important about it. It's incredibly important that he had that conversation with the French engineer who worked in the Department of Water Communication, who then set the whole thing down in a report and sent his report up the chain all the way to the minister in St. Petersburg, right? You could say, hey, we don't need to, it's not the case that something becomes historically significant just because the men in power hear about it, right? I'm not trying to make that argument. But it's really interesting to think about how the things we can know about rivers and why they matter and how they're experienced and how they're changed, like what hierarchies we need to rely on to get the documents that allow us to tell those stories. So you could say to me, that's great that Merzeevsky had this fun adventure and that, maybe people start selling salt and, I'm sure this is all really important. But it's a little anecdotal, don't you think, Kelly, right? It's a little anecdotal. And I would say, yes, it is, except for the fact that there's nothing more important to an empire than military power, right? And if we're talking about the Napoleonic Wars and the growing awareness that navies are really, really handy, and the Russian Empire wants to have a navy in the Baltic fleet, in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, there's actually nothing more important than getting oak trees from interior provinces to the shipyards and ports on the coast. And so what happens is that this little story, this exploit of Merzeevsky, not only reaches the desk of Rumansov. What does he do? What is his next move? He's in St. Petersburg. He does the obvious thing. He goes finds the Tsar and tells him, "Hey, you know what, Alexander? Um, I think we might have discovered a way to build a lot more ships of the line in the Black Sea. And I think this guy has figured it out for us. So we need you to issue a few decrees that are going to pave the way and kind of help, send a whole bunch of funding but I think we're onto something." And so within a year, Alexander has actually signed decrees that set up the privileges and obligations for hauling vessels on those shallow, kind of low-flowing parts of the Dniester River, and he invests huge numbers of rubles in making the Dniester River navigable. Because not everyone wants to run the rapids, right? Not everyone is a whitewater rafter. Not everyone is an extreme adventurer. A lot of people just want to sail down the river and sell their stuff without taking their life into their hands, right? So, um, so that's what happens for the next few years. The Russian, the Naval Ministry, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Interior, kind of all play a role in trying to get the Dniester River to be navigable. And it's a great, great story because you have a huge amount of imperial ambition, you have a huge amount of funding, and a great example of a river speaking back to the empire because the river is not really interested in being made navigable. The river is filled with bridges that already exist. There are mills everywhere along the river. Wherever there's a landowner who grows grain, there's a mill. And the mills kind of extend into the river and make it hard for ships to pass by. There's a huge amount of fishing paraphernalia in the rivers. There are nets that are cast, across the river. So there are all kinds of kind of aspects of daily agricultural life that stand in the way. And then there's also the kind of the environment, the aquatic environment of the river itself. Even with human activity set aside, there are rocks and shoals and sandbars and lots of trees that grow along the riverbanks, and their gnarled roots kind of extend into the river and again make it very, very difficult for a ship that has a hull to be able to pass by because this particular river just isn't very deep. To make matters worse, like so many of the rivers that are flowing throughout the Russian Empire and all of the empires of Eurasia, the river changes its course from year to year. It's not a very stable environment. So in some one year, its depths would become its shallows, or vice versa. Navigable stretches would turn treacherous. Um, Stubborn patches of tree growth would suddenly disappear below the surface, right? Um, and because this particular stretch of river, stretches of it were not thickly inhabited, there weren't people around who could be hired to pilot vessels, who were trying to make their way down the river. So, there are a lot of challenges that are standing out to the empire if they want to build their navy, and there are lots of challenges that are preventing landowners in the region from being able to sell their goods. And basically, what happens over the next 10 to 15, 20 years is a struggle, to see if those things can be overcome. And, for those of us who are interested in river history, the idea of navigability, if it's something that interests you, right, there are a huge number of documents that describe this kind of thing. I think river stories are really fantastic because as much as they are very particular about the unique environments of each particular river, there are a lot of transferable stories, right? So the story of the Dniester bears a lot of resemblance to what happens with the Dnieper River, the Don River, um, the Mississippi River, right? The Missouri there. River stories, and one of the really interesting things is the way that they now enable us to create a comparative context. That was the word, comparative contexts, which at least, for the students, particularly undergraduates, even graduate students, I don't teach high school students, but many of you do. They like to have a comparative context, right? Oftentimes, they're not familiar with a river like the Dniester, right? I wasn't either until I went through the whole PhD process. It's nice to be able to take something that is not familiar and put it in the context of something that is familiar. And the wonderful thing about river history, especially once you hit the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, is that the technological story, the technology that's being applied to rivers across various geographical contexts, is pretty consistent, right? And you don't have the dam building, the dredging, the canal building. You actually have many, many cases of experts who are crossing international boundaries, who are writing to one another, who are kind of in a community of practitioners. That is a really, really nice kind of connection to be able to draw. The other thing that is fun about the way that people thought about rivers in the 18th and 19th century is that they created documents and they also created maps. And every once in a while, you get maps that are just really evocative, and useful for teaching. Let me skip over these princes. I have a picture. I have my Barks and Galleys. Yeah. So I was looking around, at maps of the Dniester River. There aren't actually a lot of really, really great ones. Um, but I found this one, and the story that I was telling you is taking place in the Napoleonic period. This is a German map from 1815. Um, this is a map it looks very authoritative, right? The geography is very solid. It's a 19th century map. It's very good. The German cartographers are excellent. What's interesting about this map is that it particularly shows the Dniester River. And if you're able, I know it's hard to see a map on a Zoom screen, but there's a yellow ink that travels along the Dniester River. And if you follow it, you'll see that it goes from the Black Sea coast. If you follow it upriver, you'll see that it just keeps going, right? It keeps going all the way to the Baltic, which is magical, right? Because it's made up completely, right? There is no riverine transport system that connects the Dniester to the Baltic. This is an imagined river geography, right? And that this German cartographer, it wasn't just the Russians who were thinking about how to get oak trees down into the Black Sea to build navies. And it wasn't just landowners in Ukrainian territory and Polish territory and Belarusian territory who want to make money off their oak trees and their grain and their wine and all kinds of things that are growing there. The Germans are looking out at this territory and thinking, ooh, we don't want all of those goods to flow south to the Black Sea. We would like all of those goods to flow north into German territories, right? And make all the money that way. Do you think this is possible? Well, let's figure it out and we'll show people maps that show it's possible and, maybe we can make this happen. It doesn't happen. I did make double sure. It didn't actually happen. But these kinds of sources are out there. They're all part of this really ambitious, energetic moment, right? In the late 18th, early 19th century, where people are starting to feel the power of technological innovation. They're starting to experiment with ways to kind of shape narratives of empire to, you know, this is like propaganda. This is people weighing in. This is like the social media of its day, this map, right? By this German guy who's trying to make an argument that people should be investing in making this happen. So you begin to see people playing with all of these levers of modern technology and communication, all because they're trying to figure out how to make rivers work for them. The last thing I wanted to show you, I can tell you all kinds of more things about all the oak trees and how they counted them and all that kind of stuff, but I'm going to skip that. I just wanted to make one last point with a really weird looking slide. Um, Coming back to this notion of what kinds of sources we can use to understand rivers. Um, so the technology changes over the course of the 19th century. The information that people compiled about rivers changes in its nature over the course of the 19th century as well. And thinking about the structure of information and what people were writing down about things is really, really important, right? So I started you off with the geographical dictionary excerpts, those tiny little texts, right, that were describing the Dniester River in a very perfunctory way in the 1790s and then the 1820s. Fast forward to the end of the 19th century. This is the first page of a publication of the Department of Water Transport, that same department that green-robed fellow was in charge of at the beginning of the 19th century. At the end, that department published a like 200-page volume describing the Dniester River. And this is the first page. And the point that I wanted to make here with this slide, this is basically just the same kind of thing you'd find in the geographical dictionary. It's the initial description of the river. And the description basically is a list of all of the names that have been given to the Dniester River over time, right? And so what this excerpt is actually doing is establishing the historical roots of the Dniester River. Ukrainians call it the Dniester. Russian speakers call it the Dniester. In the sources that I've been showing you, you're seeing, mainly Russian spellings because that's what the imperial sources used. But the first line points out that Herodotus and Strabo called the Dniester River the Tiras, right? And luckily, I share an office with a classicist who is able to explain to me that the Tiras, the name goes back to an old Indo-European root that means fast flowing or strong. So this name, the Dniester, was known as the strong or fast flowing river, and that's where its name came from the Greek. It was known later in other sources as the Danaster, the Tiras, the Dniester, the Dniester, right? It shows up in all of these different ways in Italian, Latin sources. And eventually you get the kind of Slavic name kind of really taking root. You get the Romanian listed here, the Turkish, the Turks call it the Turia. So you get this kind of rich sense that this river, which sits at the boundary of three different empires, right? The Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire, has a wealth of names, like, of course, I've been part of Roman and Greek empires, has a wealth of names, right? Has a wealth of history. And although all of that was more or less either unknown or just not judged to be really relevant a century beforehand, by the time you get to the 19th century, this catalog of this way of historicizing the river was the accepted way of doing it. And the pages that follow in that publication There are no maps, and there are no beautiful textual descriptions of what the river's like, and there's no historical narrative of the beginning of time and the end of time. All it is a list of all of the tributaries of the Dniester River in order, whether they're left bank or right bank. And that's it for 187 pages. And again, you might say, that's horrible. And why would you ever want to read through such a thing? And I haven't really read it, but it's really, really important to think about the level of like the mastery of geographical information that went into producing that text, right? It's in many ways, even though it's boring, it's a magnum opus of imperial knowledge by the end of the 19th century and tells a much different story about what rivers mean and what people think they can do with them at the time. And of course, there's a million other things to say about rivers, but I just wanted to bookend it with those two and leave it at that. So thank you for listening.